Think about the last time everything felt like a battle, the job that never recognized you no matter how hard you worked, the relationship that required constant effort just to stay in place, the plans that collapsed, the timelines that failed, the version of your life you were certain was coming, that kept not arriving. And through all of it, the frustration, the exhaustion, the quiet desperation of someone who was trying everything and getting nowhere, there was one thing you never questioned: that the problem was out there, that life was against you, that if circumstances would just cooperate, people would just behave correctly, if opportunities would just appear, if the universe would just stop working against you, everything would finally fall into place. What if that belief, that specific, deeply held, completely understandable belief, is the very thing producing the resistance you are experiencing? What if the battle is not between you and life? What if the battle is between you and you? Friedrich Nietzsche spent his entire philosophical life circling this question, not gently, not reassuringly, with the full force of a mind that refused to let human beings hide from themselves. And what he found, what he articulated in ways that still cut more than a century later, is one of the most liberating and most uncomfortable truths in the history of human thought. The resistance you feel is not coming from outside. It is coming from the gap between who you are and who you are refusing to become. Today, we go all the way into this, into the psychology of inner war, the philosophy of acceptance without passivity, the brutal, precise mechanics of what happens when a human being stops fighting reality, and what becomes possible the moment they do. Stay until the end. Because the final lesson is the one that changes the relationship you have with your own life. Permanently. 1. The war nobody talks about. There's a war most people are fighting every single day. Not with other people, not with their circumstances, with reality itself. It is the war of this should not be happening, of this is not fair, of this is not what I planned, of why is this so hard, of I have done everything right, why is this still not working? This war is invisible. It has no battlefield, no opponent you can point to, no moment of clear engagement, but it consumes an extraordinary amount of energy. Energy that could be building something, or energy that could be solving something, energy that could be becoming something. Instead, it is spent in the exhausting, futile, completely unwinnable project of arguing with what is. Nietzsche had a name for the person who has mastered the opposite of this. The person who has learned to stop fighting what is and start working with it. He called it amor fati, love of fate, not tolerance of fate, not resignation to fate, not the grim acceptance of someone who has simply given up. Love, the active, fierce, creative embrace of everything that happens. Not because everything is good, but because resistance to what is costs more than it produces. And because, and this is the part that changes everything, and within every circumstance, no matter how unwanted, there is material, raw material for becoming. So if you stop fighting it long enough to use it. 2. The psychology of resistance. Before we go deeper, let's be honest about why people fight life. Because it is not random. It is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It comes from something very human and very understandable. The belief that if you resist hard enough, reality will change. That if you are angry enough about what happened, it will unhappen. That if you worry enough about what might happen, you can prevent it. That if you rehearse the argument enough times in your head, you will eventually win it. That if you hold on to what you lost tightly enough, it will come back. None of these work. Everyone knows they don't work. And yet, almost everyone does them. Constantly. Reflexively. Without examining whether the effort is producing anything except more suffering. Nietzsche would call this the will turned against itself. The same drive that could be building, creating, growing, becoming, turned inward, consuming itself, spending its force on the immovable. Think about what resistance actually requires. It requires you to hold two realities simultaneously: what is and what should be, and to suffer in the gap between them. The more attached you are to what should be, the wider that gap. The wider the gap, the more suffering. The more suffering, the less energy available for actual change. This is not a moral failing. It is a mechanical problem. And Nietzsche was always more interested in mechanics than in morality. The question is not, should you feel resistance? The question is, what is resistance costing you? And is what it costs proportional to anything it is producing? 3. What Nietzsche meant by amor fati. This concept is widely misunderstood. So, let's be precise. Amor fati does not mean passivity. It does not mean that nothing matters. It does not mean that you should not try to change things. It does not mean that pain is not real or that injustice should be accepted. Nietzsche was not a man of passive acceptance. He was one of the most intensely active, demanding, relentlessly driving philosophers who ever lived. What amor fati means, precisely, is this: you accept what has already happened, completely, without reservation, without the energy-consuming wish that it had been different. And from that acceptance, from that clear-eyed, unflinching acknowledgement of what is, you work, not despite circumstances, with them, not around reality, through it. There is a sequence here that almost everyone gets backwards. Most people believe, I will accept this once I have changed it. I will be at peace with this situation once it resolves the way I need it to. I will stop fighting once life gives me what I was fighting for. Nietzsche's sequence is the reverse. Accept first, completely, without condition. And then, from that place of acceptance, clarity arrives. And from clarity, the most effective possible action. Acceptance is not the end of effort. It is the beginning of intelligent effort. 4. The hidden cost of controlling everything. There is a specific type of exhaustion that only people who fight life understand. It is not the exhaustion of someone who has been working hard. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been trying to control everything, every outcome, so every person's behavior, every external variable, the future, other people's perceptions. Circumstances that are, by definition, outside their control. This person is not lazy. They are often the hardest working person in any room. They plan meticulously. They anticipate every problem. They prepare for every contingency. And they are still exhausted, still anxious, still never quite at peace. Because no matter how much they control, there is always more that they can't. Nietzsche identified this pattern as one of the fundamental sources of human suffering, not the suffering of someone who has experienced genuine tragedy, the self-manufactured suffering of someone who has made their peace conditional on outcomes they cannot guarantee. I will be okay when this works out. I will relax when this is resolved. I will be at peace when people finally understand. I will stop worrying when I know it's safe. But it is never safe enough, never resolved enough, never controlled enough. Because the strategy is wrong. Peace is not something you arrive at by achieving the right external conditions. Peace is something you practice in the presence of uncertainty, and the person who cannot practice it until conditions are perfect will practice it never. Because conditions are never perfect. This is not cynicism. This is the basic, irreducible nature of being alive. 5. How fighting life produces exactly what you fear. This is Nietzsche's most counterintuitive insight on this topic, and it requires sitting with for a moment. The thing you are fighting, the outcome you most fear, and the circumstance you most resist, your resistance to it is often precisely what produces it. Not always, not in every case, but with a frequency that becomes impossible to ignore once you start watching for it. The person who is terrified of rejection, who approaches every relationship with the tense, controlling energy of someone who cannot afford to lose, produces in the other person exactly the discomfort that leads to rejection. The person who is desperate for success, who grips the goal so tightly that every setback becomes catastrophic, makes decisions from anxiety rather than clarity, and produces setbacks. The person who fights the reality of their health, their finances, and their relationships, who spends so much energy arguing with where they are that they have nothing left for the journey toward where they want to be, stays exactly where they are. This is not mysticism. It is psychology. Anxiety produces poor decisions. Poor decisions produce bad outcomes. Rigidity produces brittleness. Brittleness produces collapse under pressure. Desperation repels what it seeks. Fullness attracts what relaxation allows. Nietzsche saw this in terms of the will to power, that life force, that fundamental drive toward growth and becoming. When it flows outward, toward creation, toward challenge, toward becoming, it builds. When it turns inward, toward resistance, toward control, toward fighting what cannot be changed, it destroys. The will turned against reality is still the will. It is simply spending itself on the wrong target. 6. The difference between acceptance and resignation. Let's make this distinction completely clear, because this is where people get lost. Resignation says, nothing can change, so I will not try. It is the posture of defeat, of someone who has decided that effort is pointless. It produces stillness, yes, but a dead stillness, the stillness of someone who has given up. Acceptance says, this is what is. Right now, in this moment. And from this exact reality, not the one I wished for, I will work. Resignation is passive and comes from despair. Acceptance is active and comes from clarity. Nietzsche had no interest in resignation. He was the philosopher of the will, of drive, of creation, of becoming. The last thing he was advocating for was giving up. What he was advocating for was something much more demanding. The discipline of engaging with reality as it is, not as you wish it were. The courage of building with the materials you actually have, not the ones you were hoping for. The intelligence of working with your circumstances rather than exhausting yourself fighting them. A sculptor does not fight the marble. They do not wish it were a different material. They do not spend their creative energy arguing with its grain and density and resistance. They understand it. They work with it. They find within its specific nature the form that is possible, and they bring it out. This is amor fati applied, not passive, not resigned, deeply, actively, creatively engaged with what is, and producing from it, from this exact reality, with these exact circumstances, in this exact moment, something that would not have existed without the struggle. 7. What happens when you stop fighting? Let's be specific about what actually changes, not philosophically, practically. In your daily life, your energy returns. The single largest drain on most people's energy is not their work. It is their resistance. The constant, low-grade background consumption of fighting what is, replaying what happened, rehearsing what might happen, arguing in your head with people who aren't in the room. When this stops, even partially, even gradually, something extraordinary happens. Energy becomes available that you forgot you had. Creativity that was frozen by anxiety begins to move. Clarity that was clouded by resistance becomes accessible. You do not become less capable when you stop fighting. You become more capable, because you are finally operating on full resource rather than the fraction that survives the constant drain of inner war. Your decisions improve. Decisions made from resistance are almost always poor decisions. They are reactive rather than responsive, driven by what you are trying to avoid rather than what you are trying to build. When you stop fighting, when you accept the reality of where you are, something shifts in the quality of your thinking. You stop asking, how do I escape this? And start asking, what does this make possible? That is a completely different question. and it produces completely different answers. People around you change. This one surprises people most. When you stop fighting your circumstances, the energy you bring into every interaction changes. The tense, the controlling, anxious energy of someone who is at war with their life is felt by everyone around them, even when it is never spoken. People pull back from it. They become guarded. They mirror the tension. When that changes, when the person across from them is genuinely at peace with where they are, something opens. Conversations become more honest. Relationships become more genuine. Opportunities appear that were always there but were invisible through the distortion of resistance. The world does not actually change. Your relationship to it changes. And that relationship determines almost everything about how the world responds to you.